Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Washington, D.C. update on federal government policy developments. I'm Paul Nathanson with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. We're happy to have you today. We have a very busy agenda. As always, I'm joined by my colleagues from the Franklin Partnership, Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik, who you'll be hearing from in 1 second. Caitlin Sickles is out today, but we have a lot to cover. Omar, if you heard typing last night at 4 in the morning, that was Omar finishing up his slides because we have a lot of information. So we might go a little long, but by a little long, Omar promises that he will be done by 12:37. We have a steak dinner that we have a bet on it. So the contents today, we're going to talk about what's going on Capitol Hill. Besides the George Santos being expelled about a half hour ago, some regulatory updates and the OSHA heat rule that we've been talking about, the latest on the EU carbon border adjustments, and early on I'm going to talk a little bit about trade and the current ongoing spat between the United States and the European Union over the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John. Oh, I guess I took your agenda items, John. Sorry. I'm going to turn it over to myself. I'm in charge here. So I moved up the media slide just because there has been a lot of coverage over the last couple of weeks, or the last couple of months actually, regarding the negotiations between the United States and the European Union regarding the Section 232 steel tariffs and aluminum tariffs. And you might say to yourself, I thought that was resolved over a year ago when the US and the EU decided to agreed to replace the Section 232 tariffs imposed on the EU with tariff rate quotas, and the EU agreed to not impose retaliatory tariffs. Well, that deal was only for a year, and they were supposed to come up with a longer term agreement that involved a Green Steel Club. And despite several assurances for the last 4 months that they are going to have a deal, there was no deal announced when there was a big summit in October between President Biden and some trade leaders from the EU and the head of the EU. So they've kicked the can down the road, but there's been some signs that they still don't have an agreement, and folks are getting worried about the reimposition of tariffs. We still don't think that will happen, but it is a good, it should be interesting to something to look at. What we're doing is both NTMA and PMA are members of the Coalition of American Metal Manufacturers and Users, coalition of folks of steel users and aluminum users, and we are going to be out there in the media reminding folks about what this is all about, so that the de facto position of the United States that the steel industry must be protected at all costs. We want to remind folks that we are the steel industry's customers, and that the fact that the steel industry is still announcing closures of and layoffs of their domestic plants, including the one from today's paper that was sent to me by One Voice member about closing the Granite City furnace indefinitely. We should really be thinking about a policy that promotes both the steel industry and steel users. And you can see on the next slide there that steel prices in the United States have been creeping up and are widening compared, and I know this is what you're concerned about, not so much that the price of steel, but the price of steel compared to what your colleagues, your competitors overseas pay for. And you can see here that the gap between what U.S. steel users are paying for compared to what the rest of the world is paying is growing. So we'll keep you posted on that. Now I think, send it over to John.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you.
Yeah.
Before the Congress adjourned for Thanksgiving, they had a deadline to keep government funding or have a government shutdown. They had to pass a continuing resolution to keep government funded. And so traditionally, they lump all 12 or unpassed appropriations bills into one large legislative package and pass it all at once. And they generally would do a continuing resolution until sometime in December. Put pressure on Congress to do something, because as we all know, Congress doesn't do anything unless there's a deadline. Well, this year there's been pushback that they don't like ruining members of Congress's holiday season. And so the new speakers came up with a two-phase approach to keep government funding. Essentially, they voted to keep government funded until two stages. One stage expires on January 19th. Essentially, 20% of agencies funding is set to expire on January 19th. So we don't have the threat of one government shutdown, we have a threat of another one, because on February 2nd, 80% of federal agency funding expires. And these are the controversial ones: labor, health and human services, defense, commerce, justice, science. So this is going to be heavy lifting. It's a lot of uncertainty right now whether they're going to be able to get it done. In the first tranche, the first four bills, agriculture, for example, is considered supposed to be one of the easy ones. Well, that one got held up in the House of Representatives, and they never even passed it. And so, as we have mentioned in the past, I think the House has passed 7 out of 12 appropriations bills. The Senate has passed, I think, maybe 3 of them, but there's still a lot of uncertainty out there moving forward. So what does this delay mean for our tax discussion and our wish list? Keep in mind, Congress is only in session 18 legislative days before the first deadline of January 19th. There's a number of items that they want to get passed. The good news is the Freedom Caucus, a group of about 20, 30 very conservative members of the House of Representatives, have backed down on their demand that they do significant cuts in government spending. This was the issue that essentially led to Kevin McCarthy being dethroned as Speaker of the House. If they had made that decision earlier, perhaps Kevin McCarthy, may still be Speaker. But so in addition to this deadline of getting all these appropriations bills, there's still talks on a war supplemental supporting Ukraine and such. And included in those talks, Republicans are insisting on including some border language. And so we can expect that sometime in December. The National Defense Authorization has gone to conference committee. Now, this isn't your typical conference committee that you learned in school, where your House and Senate members banter back and forth and talk about changes in the bill. This is a bill that's being written by the leadership in both the House and the Senate. And because of that, and because of many other reasons, we believe you're going to need roughly 2/3 of the United States House of Representatives to pass this bill and have it come into effect. So, and then there's also foreign surveillance legislation, which the authorization expires at the end of next year. So what does this mean for our legislative agenda, and particularly our tax bills? We have been talking for months now that we've educated the members that Congress does not pass standalone bills. We were going to attach our tax priorities, which is the RD fix, 100% bonus depreciation, 163J, which is business loan deductibility. We were going to attach to a vehicle, a year-end vehicle, and typically that year-end vehicle would be that continuing resolution or government funding bill. Well, because they punted the House and Senate punted it until that 2 phases that I just talked about earlier, we no longer have that vehicle. And so we do believe this is going to delay action on our primary tax provisions until sometime in 2024. Still, House Republicans and Senate Democrats are talking. That's the good news. Senate Democrats continue to want to include in this tax bill an enhanced child tax credit provision. But we're also learning, as we've mentioned and heard from many One Voice members, is the discussions of the retroactivity of the R&D tax credit. It changed in 2022. Well, the Senate looks like is insisting that if there's going to be a fix, it's going to be fixed to the R&D. It's going to be for 3 years, 23, 24, and 25. So we will not get retroactivity back to 22. We had thought that all along, the later we went to 23, the less likely that the Congress would pass some sort of uh, uh, retroactivity for 2022. But let me turn it over to Omar. Omar, there's a lot of regulatory issues that are coming down the pike. The heat rule that Paul mentioned, the Customs Border Adjustment Mechanism. So there's a whole number of regulatory issues.
Yep, thanks, John. And let's see if Paul's buying me that steak dinner here. We're not going to go through everything on this. A lot of this is going to be for your references, especially as we get into some compliance areas as well, and especially as you just listen to what John had to say on taxes and you 2022 planners that we're hoping to potentially have some support from the R&D side. Please take note of what John said, go back, discuss it, and feel free to reach out to us if you want some more information on the impacts there. We are also seeing that the Office of Management and Budget, part of the White House, is changing the way that they direct agencies to conduct the regulatory rulemaking. They're doing a couple of things here. Even if the benefit and the cost, rather, of developing a regulation is too high, you can actually discount it now under a new rule, the impact it would have on industry, because it might have an insurmountable benefit to a certain segment of the population. So basically, they're going to take a discount rate to certain costs that factor into an analysis when you create a regulation. Similar when you look at some of the compliance with regards to climate change regulations that are coming out of EPA, energy, and elsewhere, the new directive from the White House will allow them to take a longer look approach in terms of the cost. So instead of saying that you've got a very high upfront cost for industry to comply, you can now spread that out over a longer period of time and say, no, the impact on industry is not so great. And you can take a look at the entire life cycle of forcing implementation of a new climate or energy capture type of system. That should certainly allow the EPA and other agencies to move more quickly with regard to some of the regulatory priorities. These are what we call A circulars. A4 and A94 are the two to take a look at, and they are the foundation for some of the other changes here as well. On OSHA, we just saw some of the data. John and I worked on this back in 2015 during the Obama era. Starting back then, there was a rule change that required some of the severe injury reporting that deals with amputations that must be reported within 24 hours, certain fatalities that must be reported immediately within several hours. And now the data is increasingly starting to come out with a focus on certain industries. And you'll see on the right-hand side of the nearly 57,000 hospitalizations reported over the 7-year span. These are all federal OSHA data, by the way, we'll get to that. 27.3% came out of the manufacturing sector with regards to these severe industries. And those are reported as inpatient hospitalizations, amputations, eye loss, ranging again from 2015 through 2021. This is only federal run state data. For those states that have their own programs, they obviously have their own reporting systems internally that they put out to the public. But as you can see from the 2015 to 21, going back to that rule change, have to require some, as I mentioned, within 24 hours. And the OSHA receives a total of 70,000 severe injury reports from employers under the OSHA in all states, the federal all states that OSHA is running there. And you can see the report for more details. And it also even provides some more data based on industry using your NAICS codes. And we put in here a copy and paste of select ones where you can see that the different, what we call the severe injury reports, the SIRs, for those federal run OSHA states and where they appear in this on this list, and you'll see the total tally. Again, just keeping in mind, and this, as OSHA puts these numbers out, they will certainly continue their enforcement and to make sure that companies are requiring, if you do happen to have something that falls in within this category and you're a federal run OSHA state, keep in mind this is how that data is being used as well. This is just a renewal, no major change, but for those of you that are in Pennsylvania and a few other mid-Atlantic states here, that they did renew their noise emphasis standard here. What these are called are regional emphasis programs, in addition to national emphasis programs that OSHA puts out. Certain regions put those that they want their OSHA inspectors to take a look out. So what these mean is that for every OSHA inspector within the Mid-Atlantic region, if they go into a manufacturing shop that's listed in here, metalworking fabrication manufacturers are listed under their NAICS, for example. If they go into one of those shops in Delaware, West Virginia, or Pennsylvania, this is going to be one of their top items that they take a look at, in addition to the national emphasis program requirements that are already there under HEAT. So this is a directive to their own inspectors and what to go on there. And this is if you have not already seen it. We know we mentioned this coming up in the past. This relates to the IRS and OSHA. And the IRS, under the employee retention credit that was created during the coronavirus pandemic by Congress and modified a number of times, it had to be under the directive of a state, local, or federal government, or some type of entity that had legal authority to require your shutdown in order for you to be claiming that full employee retention credit. A clarification came out from the IRS saying that a guidance from OSHA itself is not acceptable for you to have shut down or suspended your operations, as they are not an appropriate governmental authority under the purposes of that guidance. So keep that in mind. If you did claim your employee retention credit and you are still dealing with that as an issue, make sure that your citations that you have as credited for that are one of those appropriate authorities that would include a state or local government, including the federal, but OSHA itself did not count in there. One more quick reminder for those of you that are subject to the EEOC reporting requirements, EEO1 component data collection, that is due on December 5th, and that's coming up for those that have 100 or more employees, or you government contractors with $50,000 or more contracts and 50 or more employees as well. So those EEO1 reports with regards to some of the demographics information that's there, also again, reminder, required to be filed December 5th. That's been delayed a couple of times there. Wanted to put back on folks' radar screen that sometime in early January, but possibly some into early spring, we could still see an overtime rule. John and I and others in Washington work with the Small Business Office of Advocacy on a number of issues, and they did issue a letter of concern over increasing the overtime threshold from the current $35,568, which under now the timeline of the final rule would likely be at least $60,000 for those eligible for time and a half under the EAP requirements that are already in place there. So that's something to note, that there is actually a voice within the administration, not a very loud one, but they are very helpful and supportive of this, and we've been coordinating and on their regular meetings that keep coming up. This one is on cybersecurity. For many of you that have asked us this, really dating back to December of 2017, there were a number of triggers with regards to the cybersecurity maturity model certifications. The CMMC that Obama put in place and then triggered during December of 2017. If you're a Department of Defense subcontractor or contractor, there are a number of requirements that are put in place with regards to cybersecurity that came into different triggers, levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. Many of you have different requirements for which you've had to comply. You've been asking us about this for quite some time, that in the defense world, especially that it has been told to us by DoD that these are allowable costs for your compliance with cybersecurity. Now the DoD and what's called Project Spectrum, since they're phasing out the CMMC term, they've now put up some actual courses. You can see there's my login on the top left. It's easy, create a login, and there's a number of different platform items that you can go in and have a better understanding of what is required under the different controls. We've mentioned that this is coming in the past here when they were working through the documents over the September timeframe. So again, if you're a DoD contractor, even government contractor in general, and you've been asked about cybersecurity requirements, which are now all embedded in your contracts by now, you should be taking a look at this government resource that is available and is considered authoritative. For our friends in California and that ship to the state of California that must comply with Prop 65, please double check with whoever's handling that compliance for you. There is a new change that is put into effect that California is revising their Prop 65 short form, which most are interpreting as effectively gets rid of your ability to simply just say warning, cancer causing. There's a number of requirements that are now going to be expanded. If you're going to have to do a modified mini long form, as some are calling it, this does not just apply to food warnings. You can do that, but also for those of you that have individual products and packagings and how those are labeled, whether it's on top of the actual plastic it might be wrapped in, the outside box, all of those now are affected if you're shipping into California under this as well. Keep in mind, there is also significant compliance if any of you have an online catalog that can be viewed and purchased by anybody in the state of California. If you've got a zip code that gets entered in pre-billing stage, it starts with a 9 or whatever California is, there should be a warning of Prop 65 for virtually most of you on this call, because your products do likely contain some of the cancer causing items that they have been listed in there, and the very least you want to pass along that type of liability, which is why there's attorneys that make a killing doing this, but advising companies on how to comply, especially if you've got an online catalog. If you're going to a trade show and you're leaving a printed catalog for Prop 65 purposes, there should be a warning. Please note that there is now that revision. As you can see, they're estimating some of their compliance requirements here in terms of the short form labeling and how much it would cost per business. If you're looking at the automotive parts, for example, that might, or vehicle parts, it's about $700 per business. All of it adds up. More importantly, if you don't do it, the lawyers are literally trolling and just trying to find cases of your online or in-person catalogs that they can go ahead and start a case against you. On a more positive note, the Department of Energy, this isn't really as significant, but they are trying to demonstrate and highlight businesses and industry that are trying to make concerted efforts to reduce some of their footprint with regards to carbon and being more energy efficient. So this is another example of some of their applications that they have to help promote your company. So if you are already doing something that you do feel that helping promote would help you in any way, this is an opportunity on the decarbonization initiative that the Department of Energy is running there as well. We did want to flag for you a couple of things to take away from the next several slides is that now that we have this report from OSHA on the impact of the indoor and outdoor 80-degree heat rule on small businesses, they can move forward with issuing a proposed rule if they are so inclined. On November 3rd, the Small Business Administration released that OSHA has now received their small business advocacy review of that OSHA standard. And reminder of what this is that when the heat index exceeds 80 degrees Fahrenheit, OSHA is considering putting requirements on indoor workstations, including mandatory work breaks of between 10 minutes every 2 hours. At a certain temperature, higher heat, it's going to be at every 15 or 15 minutes every 2 hours, including a number of training and weather acclimatization requirements that they would put in there. They did receive a number of comments, including from One Voice that we submitted with regards to the impact on small businesses, and they gave an overview of the different comments that you will see here that you can take a look. But they really followed a lot of what we wrote with regards to needing flexibility, with regards to some of the heat recommendations that we had put out as well, because the one-size-fits-all approach that OSHA had begun with earlier clearly would not work for the industry, especially if they look at heat triggers that are too low. Most recommendations came in was going to be something on a much higher level than the 80-degree Fahrenheit that was in there as well. The record keeping, though, on that OSHA, on the simplification of record keeping, that per our previous slide, with regards to the severe injury reports, we don't expect them to simplify or back off much on the record keeping based on the different sessions that we participated in. But on the temperature measurements, there did seem to be some flexibility with regard. So these are some of the recommendations that they had put, that the small business community, including ourselves, had put forth. And now that they have received it, they can issue some kind of a heat rule sometime in the coming months, possibly, certainly sometime by next summer, if they continue to receive pressure from some of the Democratic-led states that are out there. And keep in mind that we really do want to flag with regards to this. This is still in a proposed rule, and this is a report with recommendations. OSHA, these are recommendations from business, which means OSHA will obviously look at it from their own standpoint and what they would like to see. But between now and potentially a proposed rule, every person on this call, every business is still required to comply with the National Emphasis Program that is currently in place with regards to heat. That April 8th of 2022 requirements, those have a number of listings, including on record keeping, including on training, that all of you are already required to do, including having your training manual updated. So again, that April 8th of 2022 National Emphasis Program on heat should be all on your radar screens. We did also have that, if those of you that want to find it, on onevoiceinfo.org website. The May 2022 webinar did include a slide on that National Emphasis Program if you do want to back reference. So again, now that they've concluded the small business review, we could see anything as early as, in not likely January, but sometime in late winter and early spring that would start triggering some of these requirements, especially if the Biden administration wants to get it in on their first term that's out there. Now on one more that we'll deal with on compliance and then start moving on and get us on time. The European Union, we've mentioned this in the past, has now effective on October 1st started requiring compliance with their carbon border adjustment mechanism for certain industries. The CBAM is something that they've been talked about for some time, that was intended to replace their emissions reporting system and that trading system that was created and also in place. So effective on October 1st, a reporting mechanism for the following industries that you see on top: cement, fertilizers, iron, steel, aluminum, hydrogen, and then electricity. And within this, there's also a separate category. If you go through some of the NAICS codes, you'll see a number of products that we'll touch on in a minute that will also be required. What is required now under this carbon border adjustment mechanism? If you are a manufacturer of one of those products and you're an exporter into one of the 27 EU states, you will then have to describe and report on your direct and indirect emissions reporting periods on a quarterly basis. And starting in 2026, you're going to actually have to purchase import certificates if your carbon emissions are not offset by something in a domestic program or other international agreement. You'll see what they're going to be requiring and the categories. This is directly from their compliance guidance that was released on October 27th and has now pretty much all the details for folks that are in this industry. We put this here for you because we know that not all of you, or a few of you rather, will have to comply with this, but you will start potentially receiving some inquiries from many of your customers. Also, by 2030, the EU is going to expand this list to look at the other goods and imports from countries that were considered but not included in the final package, which means they are slated to expand these to quite a bit of other imports that are going in with regards to the reporting requirements. And the exports of those are going to be with regards to the guidance, obviously, if you sell them into or trade with a EU customer. So again, if you're indirectly selling it, then you also might be receiving these inquiries from some of your customers. And to keep in mind that there are a number of different requirements with regards to having the data ahead of time and populated, especially by next summer. And again, here's where you get a better sense of the different covered goods. When we get into your NAICS codes that are of most importance for your industry, it's going to start coming into the 72s and the 73s. And that's where you'll start seeing a few others that could be in that some of your associate members, affiliate members, and even some of your suppliers might now have to start requiring some of their compliance, which means their costs will start going up. Bars, rods, and some of these flat rolled products, alloy steel are in here as well. A number of the other steel, obviously, that you can think of, and the other issues that are being on aluminum that are going out as well. Screws, bolts, this is NAICS 73, or HTS rather, 7318. Screws, bolts, nuts, coach screws, hooks, rivets, other similar items, washers, spring washers. We might have some of our manufacturers that are exporting some of these items into the EU that would now starting to be required effective October 1st to start requiring all of this data into their shipments and along to their shipments before it's accepted into the EU. So just start thinking about the added compliance that maybe some of your suppliers are dealing with, some of you might be dealing with, and at some point or another, it could be expanded by the end of the decade. We also put this forward as the United States is starting to contemplate, be at a lot slower pace, doing something similar, which might end up resulting in you also having to fill out the goods produced, the installation of the emissions, the direct emissions for that product, indirect emissions, what is the production method that your product specifically was produced by, and then what are some of those direct emissions, and see how it goes even further with regard to all of these are from the actual forms that you'll see that are on there. And for many of you that are wondering, how am I going to get my total CO2 emissions, total biomass emissions, and all of these others, those are some of the concerns that on the smaller business side are really have challenges here with trying to comply with and figuring out the best pathway forward. Again, not many companies yet will have to start complying, but I think it's important to have a better understanding of what the EU is now has that is up and running. This is not a proposal. Starting in 2026, certificates, trading certificates will have to be bought. And you've already seen that model starting to be implemented in some other places, as we've discussed at the federal level, California, Quebec, and some other places there as well. Speaking on that one, energy investment tax credits, as we'll get ready just to wrap up here in a few minutes. Wanted to flag that the IRS has done a few things. We won't touch on the EV credit today for the battery electric vehicles. There was an announcement a few hours ago from the Treasury Department with regards to limitations on what will be accepted in terms of the 7,500 tax credit there and how it will be affect folks that have already been under production. We'll touch that on to the next one. But there was a notice of proposed rulemaking issued by the Treasury Department and the IRS to define what is an energy property that's out there, and going to figure out exactly what is subject to it. So some of your customers may start to benefit from some of these credits under Section 48. If you are supplying anything for a microturbine, for fuel cells, under geotherm, anything under biogas, small wind energy, what you might start seeing is questions from them in terms of where is your product, where is your steel coming from? They might start trying to claim some of the expanded domestic manufacturing Buy America credits that were included in these as well. So it's important to start tracking, one, am I personally eligible for Section 48 under the new proposed rules of it? And if so, what are the base credit, which would be 6%, that you can grab? But then if you're adding in some of the apprenticeships and the prevailing wage requirements, then you can have it bonused all the way up to 30% on there, as well as part of expanding a facility or building a new facility for some of those purposes. So again, as you see on the bottom, there's additional bonus credits that might be eligible for some of these communities that are out there. Again, just one more thing to please put on your radar screen for your CPA and your CFOs out there. You never know if you're not using it today. Many of these programs are eligible through 2029, starting to phase out in 2032. And if you're working on your longer term business strategies that we help try to advise on, try to factor these in, especially under Sections 48 and Section 45 will be some of your two big ones under the expansion under the Inflation Reduction Act that have issued a lot of guidance just in the last 45 days now since the early October with regards to that. Not to be outdone, but Commerce Department is continuing to issue a number of its initiatives, and they've done a follow-ups as well with regards to workforce components. I know we've talked to Roger at NTMA and others about they keep putting out these initiatives where you're going to get the people. And so as part of the growing the future of manufacturing, as you can see in a number of these areas, they do start to add onto workforce, and we do have 31 designated tech hubs. We put this up here as we've done in the past for other programs, because in your region, there might be opportunities for your company to partner with some of the nonprofits and the groups there that are starting to work on the expansion, on R&D and implementation and growing here in the US. And so there might be some benefit in reaching out depending on what entity is going to be leading that. And you can look at this through the Department of Commerce website. You'll see down at the bottom, and similar for concept papers that are for semiconductor projects, fundings that is open under CHIPS. Again, for now, the smaller scales that are going to be under 300 million, those programs and concept papers are now open for us. I encourage you to take a look at. And for those of you that have submitted a 48C, that's the one that deals with the energy property, and you might have gotten a letter of discouragement from the Department of Energy. We have heard of that, and most folks are probably going to wait for round 2 if they had received a letter of discouragement under 48C, but there's still opportunity to resubmit if that makes some sense from there as well. A few other things to round out as we wrap up here. The White House Council on Supply Chains was just created and announced the other day. We've been in touch. We've worked with the Department of Commerce for many, many years, and they've also staffed up with some congressional folks we know, and they are creating a Council on Supply Chain Resilience. This echoes some of the language that John and I have been working on going back to the summer of 2022 to try to get something over at the Commerce Department so they have a better understanding of domestic supply chain vulnerabilities, and more importantly, opportunities for tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers to pair with the OEMs and the larger tier 1s to make them aware of that. So they do now have, they're moving fairly quickly on getting the supply chain center up and running that will coordinate among a number of different entities that are there as well. A few other areas, and John, feel free to jump in as well. The USTR is going through now their second review out of 5 that are required by law under the rules of the US, Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement, and they are going through that. So you automotive folks, you might be receiving some kind of a questionnaire in the spring with regards to them fulfilling the requirement to handle this report that's out there as well.
Aren't they going to be focusing a lot on how rules of origin is being implemented?
That's absolutely right. And as you remember, there were 3 different main tiers where you looked at it on the different parts, on the core parts and the other areas where they described the differences between how much of content should be for a drivetrain versus another versus the side mirror. And so as they look at that domestic content requirements, they are going to be doubling down on many of you by asking about the melted and poured requirement to John's to John's point, and the melted and poured applies to steel, and then smelted, obviously, if it's aluminum. And when you take a look at those requirements, that if you've got a product that's going to be transshipped across the 3 countries, it does have to meet those minimum thresholds of anywhere between 60 and 75%. And again, we'll see what the results are on that second round there as well. And I think Paul touched on this fairly well, so I won't spend too much time, but this, we will pause for 1 second to read a question that we did receive on this topic. This is the note that came out from the vice president or the vice chair of the commission or the European Union, top person on trade, Dombrovskis, and he basically said that it's become clear that there is no pathway for the EU and the US to agree on fully lifting the Section 232 tariffs. The US looks like is continued to move forward. We were on a call yesterday with a high-ranking official in the US government that was not pleased with the approach of the EU on this and said that they are now moving forward with renewing the tariff rate quota system for a 2-year period. And that is in response to them not coming up with a way forward on a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum, which is what they refer to as the GSA that you see on the screen. Biden in October of 2021 had pledged that by the end of October of 23, they'd come to an agreement with the EU on some kind of a carbon-based tariff system for steel and aluminum. They did not. They could not even come up with a plan B on excess steel. The EU has really pushed back. A number of their EU states have said no to the US proposals. And so as of right now, there is not a lifting to the tariffs in place on the EU side. They are still going to remain under the tariff rate quota system. The EU, for its part, has not begun the process of suspending for 2 years the retaliatory tariffs on roughly $4 billion in US exports that they put in place in retaliation. So to the question, what are the specific actions that are being taken to get rid of the Trump steel tariff? This is causing long-term damage to manufacturers who use steel to make their products. Enough is not being done. How about a large PR campaign as a slogan, stop the steel tariff? And that's something that Paul started touching on early on in our presentation when he spoke on media. And in that context, there is a larger concerted effort. Politics are very difficult. I think, John, you'd agree as well with regards to dealing with anything on China and steel if you're trying to work on Pennsylvania politics right now in this environment.
And the concern that a lot of folks domestically are concerned about is the European Union's snapback of those tariffs. And so the US is moving forward with a 2-year extension of the tariff rate quotas, as Omar mentioned. In the meantime, the EU can continue to reinstate those tariffs at a much higher rate on wine and on Harley Davidson and so many other products.
Yep, that's right. And so from the politics of it just aren't in alignment. And obviously, if it's Trump, he's going to increase tariffs, not reduce them. So from your steel planning purposes, yes, we are continuing it. That's why we are largely, instead of trying to lift all 232 tariffs, which is politically unrealistic at this juncture, we are looking at targeted lifting, starting with our allies and highest volume producers, not named China. And here's where you can see that some changes in the China exports and imports have both declined for this calendar year, and how you've seen some of them change across in other areas. As always, if you haven't had enough from us here, we're obviously going to start continuing and increasing our political coverage, since that's going to impact many things. Between now and our next webinar, we'll have our One Voice, Talking with One Voice podcast that should come out the next week or so. We encourage you to download that from wherever you do receive it. As always, it's the giving season. This is how we keep things going on this webinar and others. Some of my free compliance recommendations, please consider donating in this season to both PMA and NTMA. Those funds are certainly put to good use here in Washington. Feel free to enter in any questions you have here on the right-hand side. We did cover quite a bit today. Much of it was really more intended for you to have on file for when now you step back and say, oh, I remember now that the customer is asking for this, I know where to go back and take a look. I will answer one question from a friend of ours that wrote in, who won, DeSantis or Newsom? I'd say if you watched it, you are the one that lost. Other than that, not seeing any questions. Again, feel free to reach out to any of us if you want more details on anything that we covered, since there was quite a bit there today. Thank you. Our next webinar is going to be on Friday, January the 5th, and that will be at noon Eastern as always. Thank you all. Enjoy the holidays.